It all began on an autumn afternoon in Madrid while I was sprawled out on the couch of our tiny apartment in the Lavapiés neighborhood. The summer heat had finally dissipated, yet it wasn't cold enough to force us to turn on the heater. I was watching Money Heist on Netflix, trying to unwind after an exhausting day at the office. My job as an accountant at a logistics firm wasn't exactly thrilling, but it paid the bills and allowed John and me to live comfortably in the city center. I heard the jingle of keys at the door and sat up, expecting John to walk in. I was utterly surprised when he didn't come alone. Right behind him, like a silent shadow, entered his mother, Carmen. My heart skipped a beat. Carmen had never been warm toward me, but lately her attitude had shifted from cool detachment to barely concealed hostility. "Hi, sweetheart," John said, kissing me on the cheek. His voice was strained, as if he were holding something back. "Look who decided to drop by." Carmen stepped into the living room without taking off her coat, as though she weren't planning to stay long. Her eyes swept over the room, lingering on the TV and on me, still in my sweats. "Good afternoon, Lucy," she said in a tone that could have frozen the Mediterranean. "I see you're very busy." I felt my cheeks burn. "Hello, Carmen. We weren't expecting you. Is something wrong?" Before her mother could answer, John interjected. We ran into each other on the subway. Mom was out shopping downtown, and I invited her for a drink. I nodded, feeling awkward. There was something in the air, a palpable tension that sent chills down my spine. I got up to turn off the television and offer them something to drink, but Carmen waved me off. "Don't bother, dear. We won't be long." John sank into the armchair, avoiding eye contact with me. Carmen stood there, as if sitting down would mean she was comfortable in our home. The silence spread like spilled oil, heavy and suffocating. Finally, Carmen leaned toward John and whispered something in his ear. It was barely audible, yet in the stillness of the room, it thundered. I watched as John's expression transformed from discomfort to fury in a matter of seconds. "Why are you wasting your time?" he suddenly shouted, leaping from the armchair. His voice was laden with an anger I had never seen before. I froze, unable to understand what was happening. "What? John, what are you talking about?" But John no longer seemed to hear me. It was as if his mother's words had opened the floodgates, unleashing a torrent of emotions he'd long suppressed. "Is this really how you spend every day? Binge-watching TV and lounging around while I bust my ass at work?" I tried to defend myself, explaining that I had just come home from work and was merely taking a moment to rest, but my words bounced off an invisible wall. John was beyond reason, shouting nonsensical accusations that I was lazy and contributed nothing to our relationship. Carmen remained silent, watching the scene with an expression that teetered between satisfaction and feigned concern. I realized with a shiver that this was exactly what she wanted. She had planted a seed of doubt in John's mind, and now she was watching it sprout. The tension in the room was unbearable. John continued to yell, his face flushed with rage, veins bulging on his neck. I stepped back, bumping into the wall, unable to process what was happening. How had we come to this? How could John, the man I'd been with for 5 years, the man who had proposed to me under the Eiffel Tower, treat me like this? "John, please," I managed between sobs. "Calm down. We can talk about this." But my words only seemed to enrage him further. In a fit of rage, he snatched the remote control and hurled it to the floor. The plastic shattered, and the batteries scattered under the sofa. "Talk," he roared. "What do you want to talk about? How you're ruining our lives." Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Carmen smile faintly. This was her revenge, her way of punishing me for stealing her son. She had always thought that, in time, she'd come to accept our relationship, that she'd see how happy we were together. How wrong she was. John moved closer, his face twisted in anger. For a moment, I thought he was going to hit me. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the impact. Instead, I heard him shuffle toward the television. I opened my eyes just in time to see him grab the set with both hands. "Is this what you love so much?" he screamed. "Is this more important than me?" Then, to my horror, he lifted the TV high above his head and hurled it in my direction. Time seemed to slow down. I watched the television sail through the air, a dark, menacing mass against the pale wall. I tried to move aside, but my legs wouldn't obey. The impact was brutal. I felt a sharp pain in my head, and then everything blurred. I collapsed onto the floor, dazed and terrified. The blow was so severe that for a moment I thought my skull might have split. I clutched my head and felt a warm, sticky liquid. When I looked at my hands, they were smeared with blood. John stood there, frozen, staring at me with a mix of horror and regret, as if he had suddenly realized what he'd done. Carmen, for her part, remained unmoving, like a statue of salt, watching the destruction as if it were the downfall of Sodom and Gomorrah. "Lucy," John began, taking a tentative step toward me, but stopped when I raised my hand in a weak, clear "stay back" gesture. Tears streamed down my cheeks, mingling with the blood. The physical pain was excruciating, but it paled in comparison to the emotional agony. In that moment, looking at John, the man I loved turned monster, I felt something inside me shatter irrevocably. Carmen finally moved. She approached John and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Son," she said softly, as if consoling a child who had just broken a cherished vase, "it's not your fault. She's the one who brought this on you." Her words hit me like a slap. How could she say that? How could she justify what had just happened? I tried to stand, leaning against the wall. The room spun and nausea overwhelmed me. I needed to get out, to distance myself from John, from Carmen, from all this madness. "You've done enough damage here," Carmen said in a cold, authoritative tone. "Leave our home immediately." Our home? How had this become Carmen's house? This was my sanctuary, the place John and I had built our life together. Yet in that moment, as I looked around at the furniture we'd chosen together and the photos of our travels adorning the walls, everything felt alien and hostile. With trembling legs, I made my way to the door. John made no attempt to stop me. He just stood there, motionless, his eyes lost in a daze as if he couldn't believe what he'd done. Before I left, I turned back one last time. "John," I whispered, "why?" But he didn't answer. As I closed the door behind me, leaving the apartment that had once been my home and refuge, I realized I no longer recognized the man inside. The John I had loved was gone, replaced by someone I didn't know and, worse, someone I feared. The cool embrace of the Madrid night greeted me as I wandered the streets of Lavapiés, head throbbing and heart shattered, wondering how simple whispers could destroy everything I once held dear. The usually bustling and lively streets of Lavapiés now felt like a hostile, labyrinthine maze. I wandered aimlessly, my head pounding with pain and my heart in fragments. The bleeding had stopped, but I could feel it drying on my forehead, a constant reminder of what had just occurred. I passed by the Valle-Inclán Theater, where John and I had seen our first play together. The memory of that night, our laughter and shared dreams, cruelly contrasted with my current reality. How had we reached this point? When did the man who once vowed eternal love under the twinkling lights of El Retiro Park become capable of hurting me so? I paused in front of a storefront, assessing my appearance. The reflection in the glass was that of a woman I barely recognized. Disheveled hair, eyes puffy from crying, and a cut on my forehead that, though not deep, left a trail of dried blood. I tried to clean it off with the sleeve of my jacket, only to make matters worse. Then reality hit me with full force. I was alone, injured, without money or a phone, in the dead of night. Fear began to seize me. Where would I go? Who could I turn to? I thought of my parents, but dismissed the idea almost immediately. They lived in Toledo, and I didn't want to worry them. They had always been protective, especially my father. If they learned what had happened, they'd likely come to Madrid that very night to confront John. And that would only make things worse. Walking down Maison de Paredes Street, I remembered that my friend Sarah lived nearby at Lavapiés Square. Perhaps she could help me. I quickened my pace, feeling a spark of hope for the first time since leaving the apartment. When I reached Sarah's building, I realized I had no way of letting her know I was there. I didn't have my phone, and the building's intercom required a code I didn't know. I felt stupid and powerless. How could it be that in the 21st century I was so completely cut off? Desperate, I began pressing random doorbells, hoping someone would take pity on me and let me in. After several unsuccessful attempts, a sleepy voice answered. "Who is it?" "Please," I pleaded, "I need help. I'm looking for my friend Sarah. She's in apartment 3B. There was a moment of silence before the door buzzed open. I rushed up the stairs, praying that Sarah was home. When I reached her door, I hesitated. What if she was with someone? What if she didn't want to see me? But I had no choice. I took a deep breath and rang the bell. The door opened almost immediately, revealing a worried Sarah in her pajamas. "Lucy? What the hell?" Her voice trailed off as she took in my state. "Oh my God, what happened to you?" I couldn't hold back any longer. I collapsed into her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Sarah hugged me tightly, not caring that I was staining her pajama with blood. "Come on, get in," she said gently, guiding me into the apartment. Once inside, Sarah sat me on the sofa and went to fetch a first aid kit. As she cleaned the wound on my forehead, I recounted the events of the night through my tears. With every word, her expression shifted from concern to anger. "Lucy," she said when I finished, "this can't go on. You need to report it." I shook my head, feeling a mix of shame and fear. "I can't, Sarah. It's John. He's not usually like this. It was an accident." Sarah looked at me with a blend of compassion and frustration. "This isn't an accident, Lucy. It's domestic abuse. And it's not the first time, is it?" Her question forced me to relive moments I'd tried to forget. The fights that ended with broken objects. The times John had grabbed my arm too hard, leaving bruises that he later concealed with makeup. The insults, the humiliations. I'd always found excuses for his behavior. Stress at work, his mother's constant pressure, me provoking him. "No," I finally admitted in a quiet voice. "It's not the first time." Sarah sighed and took my hands. "Listen to me, Lucy. This isn't your fault. John has a problem and needs help, but you can't be a savior. You have to get to safety." Her words made sense, yet the idea of leaving John, of abandoning the life we'd built together, terrified me. "But what if he changes?" I asked, knowing how naive that sounded. "What if this time it's different? What if next time he kills you?" Sarah's voice trembled with emotion. "Because that's exactly what happens, Lucy. It only gets worse with time." We fell silent for a moment, her words echoing in my mind. Part of me knew she was right, yet another part clung desperately to the hope that things might go back to the way they were. "Remember when we met at college?" Sarah suddenly asked. "You were the bravest, most determined girl I'd ever met. You always said you were going to take on the world, that no one could ever tell you what you could or couldn't do." I managed a weak smile at the memory. It seemed like she was talking about someone else, a Lucy who had long since vanished. "That Lucy is still inside you," Sarah continued. "And it's time she came out again." At that moment, my phone, left at John's, began to ring. Sarah and I exchanged a knowing look. "Don't answer it," said Sarah. But I had already risen and was heading for the door. "I have to go back," I said, feeling the fear and anxiety return. "He'll be worried. He's probably calmed down by now." Sarah grabbed my arm, her face a mask of worry and frustration. "Lucy, please. Don't go back. Stay here tonight. Tomorrow, we can go to the police, get help." But I had already made up my mind. I gently freed my arm from her grasp and embraced her. "Thank you for everything, Sarah. I'll be okay, I promise." As I descended the stairs, I heard Sarah calling after me, begging me to reconsider. Yet I didn't stop. A part of me knew I was making a mistake, that I was returning to a dangerous situation. But the fear of the unknown, a life without John, was even stronger. The journey back home felt like walking to my own execution. Every step weighed heavily. The streets of Lavapes, which once seemed threatening, now offered one last refuge before facing what awaited me at home. When I reached the building's entrance, I paused. I could see the light on in our apartment. John was awake, waiting for me. I took a deep breath, summoning the courage to enter. I climbed the stairs slowly, my heart pounding faster with each floor. When I reached our door, I hesitated. I could turn back, go with Sarah, start over. But instead, I pulled out my keys and opened the door. John was sitting on the sofa, head in his hands. When he heard me come in, he looked up. His eyes were red as if he'd been crying. "Lucy," he said, jumping up. "Thank God you're back." "I'm so sorry, I don't know what came over me." He moved toward me, trying to embrace me, but I instinctively stepped back. The fear was still fresh and tangible. John paused, hurt by my rejection. "Please, Lucy, forgive me. I swear it will never happen again." It was a moment of madness. "You know I love you. I'd never want to hurt you." I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe that everything could go back to the way it was. But Sarah's words echoed in my head. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't the first time. And it probably wouldn't be the last. "John," I said, surprised by the firmness in my own voice, "this can't go on. We need help." He nodded fervently. Yes, whatever you say. I'll do anything. I'll go to therapy, quit drinking, whatever you want. Just don't leave me, please." I saw desperation in his eyes, the fear of losing me. And for a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. That we could overcome this together. But then I noticed the broken television on the floor, plastic and glass scattered across the carpet. I saw the bloodstain on the wall where it had hit me, and I knew that, no matter how much I wished it, things would never be the same. "I need time," I finally said. "I'm going to stay with Sarah for a few days." John seemed about to protest, but held back. He slowly nodded, defeated. "I understand. Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready to come back." I gathered a few things in a bag, acutely aware of John's eyes following my every move. When I was done, I headed for the door. Before leaving, I turned one last time. "I love you, John," I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. "But I can't go on like this." I closed the door behind me, as if shutting a chapter of my life. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, I felt a glimmer of hope. The cool embrace of the Madrid night enveloped me as I waited on the sidewalk outside our building for Sarah. My phone read 11:30 p.m., yet time itself seemed to have stopped. Every second stretched into an eternity, and every sound startled me, as if John might change his mind and come down to fetch me. The streets of Lavapiés, normally teeming with life even at this hour, now appeared eerily deserted, or perhaps it was just my perception, warped by the fear and confusion that gripped me. The chill seeped through my jacket, making me shiver, though I couldn't tell if it was from the cold or the shock of what I'd just experienced. As I waited, my mind kept replaying the night's events over and over. How had we come to this point? John and I had met 6 years ago in the business school at Complutense University. He studied business administration, and I studied accounting. I remember falling for his smile, his sense of humor, and the way he made me feel special. I never imagined that sweet, attentive guy would become someone capable of hurting me. A car rounded the corner, and for a moment my heart raced, thinking it was Sarah. But no, it was just a taxi passing by. I sighed, feeling more alone than ever. Instinctively, my hand went to my forehead, gently touching the wound John had caused. It no longer bled, but it hurt, a constant reminder of what had happened. How many times had I ignored the signs of his violent temper? How many times had I told myself that all couples argue? The sound of a horn snapped me out of my thoughts. It was Sarah, who had just parked her old Seat Ibiza by the curb. I ran to the car, a mix of relief and shame washing over me. "Lucy," Sarah said as she opened the passenger door, "get in, quickly." I slid into the seat, grateful for the warmth inside the car. Sarah started driving immediately, as if she feared John might show up at any moment to stop me from leaving. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. Sarah drove with intense focus, occasionally glancing at me with concern. I stared out the window, watching the streets of Madrid blur by without truly seeing them. "Are you okay?" Sarah finally asked, breaking the silence. I wanted to say yes, that everything was fine, as I always did. But the words caught in my throat, and before I knew it, I was crying uncontrollably. Sarah pulled over at a red light and clumsily wrapped her arms around me over the gear shift. "It's okay, sweetheart. It's over now. You're safe." but I didn't feel safe. I felt lost, frightened, as if the ground had suddenly vanished beneath my feet. What am I going to do now, Sarah? I managed between sobs. My whole life is with John. Our apartment, our friends, even my job. Sarah handed me a tissue and waited until I calmed down a bit before speaking again. Right now, you don't have to do anything except rest. You'll stay at my place for as long as you need. Tomorrow, with a clearer head, we'll figure out the next steps. I nodded, grateful to have a friend like her. Sarah and I had known each other since high school. We'd been through so much together. She had always been there for me, even when I distanced myself after starting my relationship with John. We should go to a hospital, Sarah suggested, eyeing my forehead with concern. That cut doesn't look good. I shook my head. It's nothing, really. I just want to sleep and forget everything for a few hours. Though unconvinced, Sarah didn't press the issue. Instead, she made a sudden decision and turned onto the next street. Where are we going? I asked, confused. This wasn't the route to her apartment. My brother's place, she replied. Nick's a lawyer, remember? I think you should talk to him. Panic surged through me. No, Sarah, please. I don't want anyone else to know. I'm not ready for that. Lucy, Sarah interrupted firmly. This isn't something you can handle alone. You need professional help, both medical and legal. Nick can advise you on your options. I wanted to protest, but deep down I knew Sarah was right. I was overwhelmed. I needed help. Nick's apartment was in the Chimbury neighborhood. Despite the late hour, the lights were on when we arrived. Sarah must have alerted him while I was lost in thought. Nick greeted us at the building's door. When he saw me, his expression shifted from concern to restrained anger. Oh my God, Lucy, he murmured as he stepped forward to examine my wound. Let's go upstairs. We have a lot to discuss. Once in his apartment, Nick insisted on thoroughly cleaning and disinfecting my cut. As he did, I recounted everything that had happened, from Carmen's whispered insinuations to the moment I decided to leave. This is serious, Lucy, Nick said when I finished. What John did is a crime. You need to file a report. The idea of pressing charges against John terrified me. I can't do that, I whispered. It's John. We've been together for 6 years. He's not like this usually. Nick and Sarah exchanged a look that I couldn't decipher. Lucy, Nick said gently, I understand you're scared and confused. But this isn't an isolated incident, is it? There have been other episodes of violence before. I slowly nodded, feeling tears welling up again. What you're experiencing is called the cycle of violence, Nick continued. It starts with tension, then comes a violent outburst, and afterward the abuser feels remorse and promises to change. But without professional help, the cycle always repeats, and each time it gets worse. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. It was exactly what I had been living through for years, but hearing it described so clinically made it even more terrifying. What options do I have? I asked, feeling small and vulnerable. Nick sat down across from me and took my hands. First and foremost, your safety. You can't go back to that apartment. Sarah told me you'll be staying with her, and I think that's a wise choice. Tomorrow we'll file a report and request a restraining order. The idea of pressing charges against John, of possibly having him arrested, brought conflicting emotions. A part of me still wanted to protect him. I still loved him despite everything. But another part, one that had been silenced for far too long, screamed that it was time to protect myself. And then? I whispered. Then, Sarah said as she sat beside me and wrapped an arm around my shoulders, you'll start rebuilding your life. Step by step, day by day. And we'll be with you every step of the way. I looked at my friends, a wave of gratitude washing over me. For the first time in a long while, I felt that maybe, just maybe, there was hope. Okay, I finally said. I'll do it. I'll file the report. Nick nodded, gently squeezing my hands. You're very brave, Lucy. It won't be easy, but it's the first step toward a better life. We spent the rest of the night discussing the next steps. Nick explained the legal process, my rights, and what to expect. Sarah even called my workplace to let them know I wouldn't be coming in the next day. Eventually, utterly exhausted both physically and emotionally, I fell asleep on the sofa. When I awoke, the first rays of sunlight filtered through the window. For a moment, disoriented, I didn't remember where I was. Then, like an avalanche, every memory of the previous night rushed back. I sat up slowly, feeling every muscle protest. Sarah was asleep on the armchair, and I could hear Nick moving in the kitchen. I got up and went to the window. Madrid was waking up, oblivious to my personal drama. People heading to work, children on their way to school, the city slowly coming to life. And I, amid it all, felt like a stranger, a castaway in my own life. But as I watched the sun rise over Madrid's rooftops, I also felt something new stirring inside me. A determination I never knew I had. It wasn't going to be easy. The road ahead was filled with obstacles and fears. But for the first time in a long time, I felt that I was taking control of my life. "Lucy?" Sarah's voice broke through my thoughts. "Are you okay?" I turned to my friend and, surprising even myself, smiled. "No," I replied honestly, "but I will be." And as Nick emerged from the kitchen carrying 3 cups of coffee, I knew it was true. This nocturnal exile marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. A chapter in which, no matter what, I would no longer ignore anyone's outbursts. The cool morning light of Madrid poured through Nick's apartment windows, bathing the living room in a golden glow that starkly contrasted with the darkness inside me. Seated at the kitchen table with an untouched cup of coffee before me, I watched as Sarah and Nick moved about the apartment, preparing for the day ahead. "Are you ready?" Sarah asked, placing a hand on my shoulder. Her voice was soft, yet I could detect the underlying worry. I nodded slowly, though the truth was, I didn't feel ready at all. How could I be? I was about to take a step that would change my life forever, pressing charges against John, the man I'd spent the last 6 years of my life with, the man I once believed was the love of my life. Nick sat down across from me, his face serious yet compassionate. "Lucy, I know this is hard, but I want you to know you're doing the right thing. What John did is a crime, and he must face the consequences." I nodded again, unable to form words. The throbbing cut on my forehead served as a constant reminder of why we were here, why I had to do this. We left the apartment in silence, the 3 of us crammed into Sarah's small car. The streets of Madrid blurred past the windows as we headed to the police station. It was a normal day for the rest of the city, people going to work, students rushing to class, tourists exploring the cobbled streets of downtown. But for me, it was the day my life would change forever. The police station was a gray, impersonal building in the heart of Chimbery. As we climbed the entrance steps, my legs felt like lead. A part of me wanted to turn back and run, to return to the life I knew, imperfect as it was. But Sarah and Nick were by my side, their silent presence giving me the strength to press on. Inside, the station was a hive of activity. Officers coming and going, citizens waiting to file reports or seek information. Nick approached the counter and explained why we were there. The officer who attended to us gave me a compassionate look before asking me to wait. The minutes dragged on endlessly. Sarah held my hand, her thumb tracing comforting circles on my palm. Nick reviewed some documents, likely preparing for what was to come. Finally, we were called. A policewoman, Inspector Ramirez, according to her badge, led us to a small interrogation room. The bare walls and metal table made me feel like I was the criminal. "Mrs. Gonzalez," Inspector Ramirez began in a professional yet gentle tone, "I understand you're here to file a domestic abuse report." I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. "I need you to tell me, in as much detail as possible, what happened last night." And so, my voice trembled at first, but grew stronger as I recounted the events of that night, the unexpected arrival of Carmen, the whispered insinuations, John's explosive anger, and the TV hurtling toward me. With every word, I relived the terror and confusion of that moment. Inspector Ramirez took notes, her face a mask of professionalism. Occasionally, she asked a clarifying question. Nick interjected at times to ensure all the legal details were properly recorded. When I finished my account, Inspector Ramirez looked at me with a mix of compassion and determination. Mrs. Gonzalez, what you've experienced is a clear case of domestic abuse. We will process your report and request an immediate restraining order against your husband." The words domestic abuse and restraining order echoed in my mind. Suddenly, everything became all too real. This was happening. I was reporting John, the man who once promised me eternal love under the starlight at El Retiro Park. "What happens now?" I whispered. Inspector Ramirez explained the process. They would take my official statement, process the report, and seek to bring John in for questioning. She warned me that he would likely be detained, at least temporarily. As I listened, a part of me wanted to retract my statement, to say it had all been a misunderstanding. But then I remembered the terror I felt when the TV flew toward me, the pain of the impact, the coldness in John's eyes. No, there was no turning back. We left the station nearly 3 hours later. I felt drained, as though I had run a marathon. The midday sun blazed overhead, momentarily blinding me as we stepped outside. "You did very well, Lucy," Nick said, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "I know it wasn't easy, but you've taken the first step to reclaiming your life." Sarah hugged me tightly. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered in my ear. "You're stronger than you think." I wanted to believe her words, to feel that strength they spoke of. But at that moment, I only felt empty and scared. "So what now?" I asked, my voice small and lost even to my own ears. "Now," Sarah said determinedly, "we go to my place. You need to rest and recover. And then, slowly, we'll start rebuilding your life." The ride to Sarah's place was a blur. My mind was overwhelmed, unable to process everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. I had gone from being a married woman with a seemingly normal life to a domestic abuse victim seeking refuge. Sarah's apartment, a small studio in the heart of Malasana, had never felt so welcoming. As soon as we entered, I collapsed onto the sofa, the pent-up tears finally bursting forth in an uncontrollable torrent. Sarah sat beside me, silently embracing me as I cried. Nick moved around the apartment, preparing tea and speaking softly on the phone, probably canceling his appointments for the day. I don't know how long I stayed like that, sobbing in my best friend's arms. When I finally managed to calm down, I felt empty, exhausted, yet strangely at peace, as if all the fear and confusion had been drained from my system. "I'm sorry," I murmured, wiping my tears with the back of my hand. "You have nothing to be sorry for," Sarah replied firmly. "You were incredibly brave today." Nick approached, offering me a cup of hot tea. "Lucy," he said as he sat in the armchair in front of us, "I know you're exhausted, but there are some things we need to discuss." I nodded and took a sip of tea. The warmth of the cup in my hands was comforting, a tether to reality. "The police are going to come for John to interrogate him," Nick began. "He'll probably be detained, at least temporarily. We need to think about your safety, both short-term and long-term." The thought of John being arrested stirred mixed feelings inside me. A part of me felt guilty, as if I were betraying him. But another part, growing with each passing minute, felt relieved. "You can't go back to your apartment," Nick continued. "At least, not for now. Do you have somewhere to stay?" Sarah jumped in before I could answer. "You'll stay here with me," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "For as long as you need." The gratitude I felt toward my friend was overwhelming. "Thank you," I managed, my voice cracking with emotion. Nick nodded in agreement. "All right, that takes care of your short-term housing. Now, about your job," it hit me like a cold bucket of water. In the midst of all this chaos, I had completely forgotten about work. "Oh my God," I groaned. "They're going to fire me." "Not necessarily," Nick said. "The law protects domestic abuse victims in the workplace. We can speak to your boss and explain the situation." The idea of my private life being exposed at work terrified me. But I knew Nick was right. I couldn't just vanish without an explanation. "Okay," I finally said. "Could you maybe talk to them?" "I don't think I could do it myself." Nick nodded understandingly. "Of course. I'll take care of it first thing tomorrow." The following hours were spent discussing the practical details of my new reality. How to manage my finances now that I no longer had access to the joint account with John. What to do with my belongings still at our apartment. how to handle the inevitable encounter with Carmen, my now ex-mother-in-law. As the sun began to set, painting the Madrid sky with hues of orange and pink, I felt the exhaustion take over. Noticing my state, Sarah suggested I rest. "Come on," she said, helping me up from the sofa. "I'll set up the bed for you." While Sarah rearranged the sofa bed, Nick prepared to leave. "Lucy," he said, taking my hands in his, "I know everything seems overwhelming now, but remember, you've taken the hardest step. From here on out, things can only get better." I wanted to believe him. I needed to. But as I lay on the sofa bed that night, listening to Sarah bustling in the kitchen and the distant hum of Madrid traffic, I couldn't shake the feeling that the real challenge was only just beginning. The refuge I'd hoped for, the sense of security and certainty, still felt distant. But as I closed my eyes, exhausted yet determined, I knew at least I was on the right path. The path toward a life free of fear, a life that was truly my own. And with that thought, I drifted into a restless sleep, the first of many in my new life as a survivor. A blaring car horn abruptly woke me. For a moment, disoriented, I didn't recognize my surroundings. The cream-colored walls, indie movie posters, the scent of incense, everything felt foreign. Then, like a tidal wave, memories of the past few days crashed over me. I was at Sarah's apartment, on her sofa bed, because my life had crumbled in a matter of hours. I sat up slowly, feeling every muscle protest. The clock on the wall read 10:30 a.m. I couldn't believe I'd slept so long. Sarah must have let me rest, knowing how much I needed it. I got up and headed to the small kitchen. On the counter, I found a note from Sarah. I went to work. "There's coffee in the machine and croissants in the bag. Call me if you need anything. Love you." Her usually messy handwriting looked especially neat, as if she'd made an extra effort for me. As I poured myself a cup of coffee, my mind wandered back to John. What was he doing now? Had he been arrested already? The thought of John in a cell evoked a storm of conflicting emotions, guilt, fear, and, surprisingly, a hint of relief. The sound of my phone interrupted my thoughts. It was an unknown number. My heart pounding, I answered. "Mrs. Gonzalez?" The voice on the other end was formal and professional. "This is Agent Martinez from the Chimberry precinct. We need you to come in as soon as possible." I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. Has something happened?" There was a pause. "I'd prefer to discuss this in person, ma'am. Can you come now?" I nodded, even though I couldn't see myself doing so. "Yes, of course. I'll be there in 30 minutes. I hung up and stared at the phone, as if it could offer the answers I needed. What could have happened? Had John done something else? Or perhaps Carmen? I quickly dressed in clothes borrowed from Sarah and left the apartment. The streets of Malesana, usually bustling and vibrant, now seemed menacing and hostile. Every face I passed made me shrink, terrified of catching sight of John or Carmen. The metro ride to Chimberry was torture. Every stop felt interminable, and the clatter of the train only heightened my anxiety. By the time I reached the precinct, I was on the brink of a nervous breakdown. Agent Martinez met me at the entrance. A middle-aged man with graying hair and a kindly expression that only served to make me more nervous. "Mrs. Gonzalez, thank you for coming so quickly," he said as he led me into a small meeting room. "Please have a seat." I sat, my legs trembling. "What happened?" Is he okay?" Agent Martinez cleared his throat. "Mrs. Gonzalez, last night we detained your husband for questioning regarding the events you reported. However, things became complicated." My heart sank. "What do you mean, complicated?" "Your brother-in-law, Nick, showed up at the station shortly after we brought your husband in. He was very agitated. He demanded to see John and, oh my God," I interrupted, panic rising in me. "What did Nick do?" The agent sighed. "There was an altercation. Your brother-in-law managed to reach the cell where we had John and, well, he struck him. Multiple times. We had to intervene to break them apart." I clutched my mouth in horror. This couldn't be happening. Nick, my protector, my support, had attacked John? Are they both okay? I managed to ask. "Your husband sustained some contusions, nothing severe. He's in the hospital receiving treatment. As for your brother-in-law, we had to detain him. He's now facing charges of assault and disturbing the peace. My head swam. Nick detained. John in the hospital. How had it come to this? There's more. Agent Martinez continued, his tone laced with discomfort. Your mother-in-law, Carmen, was present during the incident. She has filed a report against you. What? My voice wavered, nearly hysterical. A report against me? Why? She alleges that you've been manipulating your son, that your initial report is false, and that you're the true aggressor in the relationship. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Carmen, the woman who had sown all those venomous whispers, was now accusing me. It felt as if the world had turned upside down. This can't be happening, I murmured, more to myself than to the agent. Agent Martinez regarded me with sympathy. Mrs. Gonzalez, I understand this is overwhelming, but I need you to stay calm. We'll thoroughly investigate all the allegations. For now, your original report stands, and the restraining order against your husband remains in effect. I nodded mechanically, unable to fully grasp the situation. May I see Nick? The agent shook his head. I'm sorry, but that isn't possible at the moment. He's being processed, and we can't allow any visits until the procedure is complete. I left the station feeling more lost than ever. The bright Madrid sun shone down, indifferent to the chaos unfolding in my life. I sat on a nearby bench, unsure of what to do or where to go. I pulled out my phone and called Sarah. I needed my friend more than ever. Lucy? What's wrong? Sarah's concerned voice was a balm to my tormented soul. Through sobs, I recounted everything that had happened. Sarah listened silently, only interjecting occasionally to remind me to breathe or assure me that everything would be all right. I'm on my way, she said once I'd finished. Don't move from where you are. I'll be there in 20 minutes. While I waited, my mind spun with questions. How had things spiraled so out of control? Just days ago, my life was normal: husband, job, home. And now it had crumbled like a house of cards. Sarah arrived, as always, a whirlwind of energy and determination. She hugged me tightly and then looked me straight in the eyes. Listen to me, Lucy, she said firmly. This is a mess, yes, but we're going to get through it. Together. You're not alone in this. Her words were an anchor in the storm. For the first time since it all began, I felt that maybe, just maybe, I could make it out alive. What are we going to do? I asked, my voice small and frightened. Sarah squeezed my hand. First, we need to find a good lawyer. Someone who can handle everything: your original report, Carmen's accusations, Nick's situation. Everything. I nodded, grateful that at least someone had a plan. Then, Sarah continued, we focus on you. On your recovery, on your safety. The rest, we'll tackle it one step at a time. As we walked toward the metro, with Sarah chattering nonstop about lawyers and legal strategies, I felt a mix of fear and determination. The road ahead seemed dark and fraught with obstacles, but at least I wouldn't be walking it alone. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Meetings with attorneys, police statements, visits to a therapist. Each day brought a new challenge, another battle to fight. John was discharged from the hospital, and thanks to the restraining order, he couldn't come near me. Yet, his presence lingered everywhere, in the voicemails pleading for forgiveness, in the pitying glances of neighbors as I collected my things from the apartment, in the news reports about domestic abuse cases that constantly reminded me of my own situation. Nick was released on bail a week after the incident. When I saw him, his face gaunt and his eyes filled with guilt, I felt both relief and frustration. I'm so sorry, Lucy, he said, his voice breaking. I just wanted to protect you. I never meant, you didn't mean, I snapped, harsher than I intended. And now it's even more complicated. Nick nodded, accepting my rebuke. I know. I'll do everything I can to fix this. I promise. Carmen's report was dismissed due to lack of evidence, but the damage was done. Rumors spread, and suddenly I found myself the center of gossip and speculation. Some supported me, others eyed me with suspicion. The doubt that Carmen had sown had taken root. Thanks to Nick's intervention and my boss's understanding, my job was safe for the moment. I was granted an extended leave to deal with my legal and emotional situation. But I knew I'd eventually have to return and face the stares and whispers of my colleagues. Every night, lying on Sarah's sofa bed, I replayed the events that had led me here, the whispers from Carmen, John's explosive outburst, my desperate flight into the night. In my darkest moments, I wondered if I should have just endured, if I should have tried to fix things with John. But then I remembered the terror of watching the TV fly toward me, and I knew I had made the right choice. One afternoon, while waiting outside the courthouse for a preliminary hearing, I saw Carmen. She stood across the street, staring intently at me. For a moment, our eyes met. In her gaze, I saw a mixture of hatred and something else. Guilt? Remorse? Before I could decipher her expression, she turned and vanished into the crowd. That night, while having dinner with Sarah on her small balcony under Madrid's starry sky, I came to a realization. Despite all the chaos, despite the fear and uncertainty, I felt free. For the first time in years, I was making decisions for myself, facing my fears, building a life on my own terms. "What are you thinking about?" Sarah asked, noticing my silence. I smiled softly, surprised at how natural the gesture felt. That, despite everything, I'm grateful. Grateful? Sarah echoed, puzzled. Yes, I replied, the words finally making sense as I said them. Grateful for this chance to rediscover who I am. To be strong. To live without fear. Sarah squeezed my hand gently. I'm proud of you, Lucy. You've been through hell and you're still standing. As the sun set over Madrid, painting the sky in oranges and pinks, I felt a spark of hope ignite in my chest. The road ahead was still long and hard, but for the first time since it all began, I felt I had the strength to walk it. Things had worsened, yes. But from the ashes of my old life, a new Lucy was emerging. A Lucy who was stronger, wiser, and braver. And that Lucy was ready to face whatever came next. Autumn in Madrid had always been my favorite season. The crisp air, the golden leaves in El Retiro, the scent of roasted chestnuts on street corners. But this year, as I strolled down Alcala Street, autumn brought with it a blend of nostalgia and hope unlike any I'd ever experienced. 6 months had passed since that fateful night when my life took a 180-degree turn. 6 months of legal battles, intensive therapy, and a painful journey of self-discovery. Every day had been a challenge, but also an opportunity to grow and strengthen myself. I stopped in front of a bookstore window, my reflection showing a woman I barely recognized. The cut on my forehead, now an almost imperceptible scar, was a constant reminder of what I had endured. Yet my eyes, once dull and fearful, now shone with a newly discovered determination. "Lucy," I heard a familiar voice behind me. I turned to see Sarah approaching, carrying 2 coffees to go. Just in time, I smiled, taking one of the cups. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee was instantly comforting. We continued our walk toward El Retiro Park, our Saturday morning ritual, a time to catch up, for me to vent, and for Sarah to offer her unwavering support. "How was the hearing yesterday?" Sarah asked as we sat on a bench by the lake. I sighed, reliving the events of the previous day. Intense. John was there, of course. It was strange seeing him after so long. Sarah nodded, encouraging me to continue. You know, for months I'd imagined how that moment would be. Sometimes I pictured him remorseful, other times furious. But when I saw him, he just looked defeated, as if he'd finally realized the damage he'd done. "And how did that make you feel?" Sarah asked, always so attentive. I thought for a moment before answering. Sad, I guess. Sad for what we could have been if things had been different. But also, liberated. As if his defeat was the final confirmation that I made the right choice. The hearing had been long and exhausting. Carmen had repeatedly tried to discredit me, portraying me as a manipulative, deceitful wife. But the evidence was on my side. The medical reports, the testimonies of neighbors who'd heard our fights, even the reluctant admissions of mutual friends who finally chose to speak the truth. "And Nick?" Sarah asked, changing the subject. "What happened with his charges?" "They were dropped," I replied, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. John decided not to press charges against him. I think, deep down, he understood why Nick reacted the way he did. Sarah smiled, clearly relieved. I'm glad. Nick only wanted to protect you, even if his methods weren't perfect. I nodded, thinking of my brother-in-law. Our relationship had been strained since the incident, but gradually we were rebuilding our bonds. His support, even if sometimes clumsy, had been crucial throughout this process. You know, I said, watching the ducks swimming peacefully on the lake. After the hearing, John asked to speak with me privately. Sarah tensed visibly. What? Why didn't you tell me? What did he want? Calm, I smiled, placing a hand on her arm. Nothing bad happened. In fact, it was clarifying. I told Sarah about our brief conversation, how John, with tears in his eyes, apologized. Not just for that night, but for years of emotional abuse he was only now beginning to acknowledge. He spoke of the therapy he was undergoing, of confronting his own demons, and the toxic influence his mother had on his life. He said he understood if I could never forgive him, but he wanted me to know he was working to become a better person, I concluded. Sarah looked at me, worry evident in her eyes. Lucy, please, don't tell me you're considering. No, I interrupted firmly. I'm not going back to him, if that's what you mean. That chapter of my life is closed. But hearing him, seeing his genuine remorse, helped me close a chapter. To forgive, not for him, but for me. Sarah nodded, visibly relieved. I'm so proud of you, you know? You've come so far in these months. Her words filled me with a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee in my hands. Yes, it had been a difficult journey, full of obstacles and moments of doubt. There were days when I could barely get out of bed, overwhelmed by fear and uncertainty. Nights when nightmares would wake me, forcing me to relive the moment the TV flew at me over and over again. But every day, every small victory had made me stronger. Returning to work, facing curious stares and hushed whispers from colleagues had been challenging. But over time, their curiosity turned into support. My boss, in particular, had been incredibly understanding. He even offered me a promotion a few weeks ago. What are you thinking about? Sarah asked, drawing me out of my reverie. Everything and nothing, I replied with a small smile. How much my life has changed in such a short time. How grateful I am to have you by my side. Sarah hugged me tightly. I'll always be here for you, you know that. We sat in silence for a while, watching the sunlight dance on the water of the lake. Around us, life continued, couples strolling hand in hand, children laughing and running, elderly folks feeding the pigeons. It was a reminder that despite everything, the world kept turning. You know, I finally said, I've been thinking about making some changes. Sarah looked at me, intrigued. What kind of changes? Well, for starters, I think it's time I get my own place, I replied. The idea had been swirling in my head for weeks. Don't get me wrong, I'm forever grateful for your hospitality, but I need my own space to heal. Sarah nodded understandingly. I completely get it. You can stay as long as you need, but I know how important it is to have your own place. And there's something else, I continued, feeling emotions swell in my chest. I've decided to go back to school. Sarah's eyes lit up. Really? That's wonderful. What are you going to study? Social work, I said, surprised by the strength in my own voice. I want to help other women who've been through what I've been through. I want to be the support for them that you've been for me. Sarah embraced me again, tears glistening in her eyes. Lucy, that's incredible. You're going to be an amazing social worker. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and for a moment I allowed myself to envision the future. I saw myself helping other women find their inner strength, escape abusive situations, rebuild their lives. The idea filled me with a determination I'd never known before. I'm also thinking about starting a support group, I added. Something informal at first, maybe weekly meetings at a community center. A safe space where women can share their experiences and support each other. Sarah looked at me with a mix of pride and admiration. Lucy, I can't believe how much you've grown. 6 months ago, you were terrified, not knowing what to do with your life. And look at you now, making plans to change the world. Her words made me reflect. It was true, I had changed so much in these few months. The Lucy who trembled in fear on Sarah's sofa, with a cut on her forehead and a shattered heart, seemed like a completely different person. It hasn't been easy, I admitted. There were times I thought I wouldn't make it. Days when I wanted to give up and return to the life I knew, no matter how terrible it was. But you didn't, Sarah said softly. You held on. Thanks to you, I replied, squeezing her hand. And to Nick and everyone who supported me. They made me see that I deserved better, that I had the strength to change my life. We sat in silence for a while, watching the sun reflect on the lake. It was a beautiful day, full of promise and possibility. You know what? Sarah said suddenly. We should celebrate. Celebrate what? I asked, though a part of me already knew. Your rebirth, she replied with a smile. Your strength, your courage, your determination to build a better life. The idea moved me deeply. Yes, I had been through hell, but I had emerged on the other side, stronger, wiser, and determined to live life on my own terms. You're right, I smiled. We should celebrate. We rose from the bench, leaving behind the ghosts of the past. As we strolled through the park, making plans for our little celebration, I felt a surge of gratitude and hope. The journey had been far from easy, and I knew more challenges lay ahead. But for the first time in a long time, I truly felt free. Free of fear, free of doubt, free to be the person I was always meant to be. As the Madrid sun shone down on us, I knew with certainty that this wasn't the end of my story. It was only the beginning, a new chapter, filled with possibilities and promises. And I was ready to write it, one page at a time. Reborn from the abyss wasn't easy, but every tear, every moment of doubt, every internal battle had been worth it. In the end, I had found something invaluable. I had found myself. With that certainty in my heart, I took the first step toward my new future, ready to face whatever challenges life might throw my way. Because now, no matter what happened, I knew I had the strength to overcome it. I was finally the protagonist of my own story.